AI is transforming the way we do qualitative research, but right now it's a mess. There's a million different startups offering their own interesting but also crazy convoluted AI solutions to qualitative analysis. Add-ons to existing qualitative analysis software, claims that ChatGPT can do your entire analysis for you. So we're going to strip it back. What are language models? What are they good at? And how might they be able to help with qualitative analysis? So if we think about what a language model is within the context of AI as a whole and machine learning, AI being a system that replicates some kind of cognitive task. Machine learning emerging as the best way of teaching machines these tasks. A method of feeding systems large amounts of data and eventually them learning patterns from that data. Language models are typically pre-trained on, these days, very large portions of text from the internet. Hence the phrase large language models, but basically we can think of this as lots of examples of lots of different sentences. And as these examples are passed through the different layers of a neural network, and these layers is what the deep in deep learning refers to, the model learns the relationship between words, or more accurately, different fragments of words called tokens. So this is the now, I think, sadly depleted model Text DaVinci 3. This is just in a great little web app called nat.dev, which allows you to compare the outputs of these different language models, as there are many of them. And you can see here just a nonsense sentence. Once the tide had settled, I came back from the seahorse farm. I saw some absolutely crazy scenes. And this model is just predicting the next likely word. The seahorses were swimming around in all directions. Some of them were even doing flips. The water was full of bubbles and the seahorses were playing with each other. It was really amazing. So you can see here, it's just predicting the next likely word, and this is based on its pre-training. So it understands that seahorses swim, for example. You can play around with some different parameters here, like temperature, introduce a bit of randomness, but essentially this is what they're doing. Although to encode this, it does something called tokenization. So it's breaking this input and output down into different fragments of words. Now this is about as mathsy as I'm going to get in this explanation, so bear with me. The first 4 words it responds with here, the seahorses were swimming. The model is actually just predicting a sequence of numbers which correspond to fragments of words. So the, space, a, horses, space, were swimming. So spaces and punctuation make up these tokens as well. So we can think of a token as a fragment of a word or sentence like this. So there is an enormous, very, very expensive period of pre-training, especially on the latest models that have many billions of parameters. And in the end, we get a model that on its own is not terribly useful for anything. Very impressive in that they understand the relationship between tokens, meaning text is quite coherent. But unless your job is writing stories about seahorse farms, this model is not going to be terribly helpful on its own in your day job. So then what happens is these models go through a process called fine-tuning. So for example, a very helpful thing you might want to do is tweak the model so that instead of just continuing on a sentence, it would respond to a question, which is actually something called instruction tuning. So after this big, expensive round of pre-training, there's things you can do afterwards which make the output from these models a little bit more favourable to the human user. So if I ask Claude, we're in January 2025 at the moment, so all the cool kids are using Claude these days. I'm just going to ask, hi Claude, can you help me with my qualitative analysis? And it responds with a lovely positive tone. I'd be happy to help you with your qualitative analysis. Can you tell me a bit more about what you're going to be doing? So this is likely to be more of a result of its fine-tuning rather than its pre-training, because it's just setting the tone. It's asking some preliminary questions, which is kind of helpful in this instance. But if I ask it something like, can you explain grounded theory? It's giving me some more in-depth information. This one isn't actually the best it's ever done. Can you explain in a bit more detail, please? So this is a little bit high level. There we go. So we've got the kind of open coding, focused coding, theoretical. So this is all kind of interesting. So if I'm asking it a specific question, it's kind of drawing more on its pre-training data. It will have seen grounded theory mentioned a lot of times in its training set, and then it will be kind of regurgitating information around that. However, and this is absolutely key, is that a language model is not constantly learning from the input that you give it. But it does kind of give that impression. So if I tell Claude what's in my fridge, hi Claude, in my fridge is, I don't know, mushrooms, milk, yogurt, tomatoes, orange juice, and a selection of meats. So this is actually appended to any further query that we make. So it knows that we're using mushrooms and milk, and it's asking about the choice of meat that is available. But if I start a new chat and I say, hey Claude, what's in my fridge? It doesn't know. So that's a fairly simplified account of what's going on. But if you're using these models seriously, either within a chat interface or embedded in a piece of software, it's crucially important that you understand a bit about what's happening underneath the hood, because that's the first stumbling block I see a lot of people fall into, particularly these really long, sprawling conversations with a chatbot where it's getting stuff more and more wrong, starts arguing back to you, and then people insist how useless these models are for anything. But if you think about it, and you think about what it's trained on, which is a big portion of the entire internet, a lot of that is going to be argumentative Reddit threads. So it's not surprising that the model is replicating a behavior that is argumentative and tetchy. Likewise, although there's lots of brilliant, helpful, informative articles on the internet, we all know there's lots and lots of stupid made-up stuff as well. So it's really not surprising at all that these models will sometimes make stuff up or hallucinate. So if you want to know facts, a language model probably isn't your best tool. I mean, it's pretty convenient to ask it for facts or explanations, and it's especially convenient if you want to tailor that explanation, like make it simpler or tell me more. But one, this is something we'd always need to double check, and two, we shouldn't be that surprised when these models get things wrong. So let's bear all of that in mind as we start to take a look at how language models might help us in qualitative analysis. So I have these 3 short transcripts, which are interview data that I've collected from real people about their mobile phone use. Now, there's a lot of complex ethical issues around uploading participant data to these services. But as we touched on earlier, we're not training the AI on participant data. When we're uploading this, if we upload this, we're just appending our query with this participant data. Having said that, OpenAI or whatever service you're using may well be saving that data somewhere for a future training round or for fine-tuning or whatever they want. Really, often we don't know, which is the problem. So it's important to check the terms and conditions. I would say Anthropic says that Claude, for example, currently does not use user-submitted data for training. but nevertheless, security and privacy may be a concern. I have explicit permission to use these transcripts in this way. These are transcripts I use for teaching. They're pretty short and have been carefully anonymized, but there are ways of using language models more mindful of these privacy security considerations, which we'll touch on later. So let's start the lazy way. So we've got our language model here. Again, Claude. We're going to upload each of our transcripts, and I'm going to say, I'm doing a thematic analysis. Please do a thematic analysis of this data. Alrighty, so it's written an analysis. It's identified some themes: personal identity and memory repository, digital extension of self, cultural connection tool, a crucial link to home, management of boundaries. So yes, these are all fair. Because I know these transcripts quite well, I know that this is more or less a fair overview of what's going on. What these models tend to do, though, is give something on the surface that looks fine, but then actually it's sticking quite closely to this sort of surface level understandings of the data. It's basically a glorified summary that it's giving here, which is fine. It might be helpful in our analysis. What I might be tempted to do, though, is, can you be a bit more creative in your analysis? So here I've asked the language model to be a little bit more creative in its interpretation, but reading through this, we have to be very careful because as soon as it's told to be a bit more creative, then it does kind of start making stuff up. So she's expressing a profound truth about how these devices have become externalized pieces of our psyche. It's like, I think if I read that in an analysis, I would perhaps suggest that they are overclaiming around the text. So this kind of prompting may or may not be helpful. In general, these models tend to be pretty good at providing summaries. So, for example, we can say, "Hi, Claude, please can you summarize this for my..." So actually, I've asked it to summarize one transcript, but it's already kind of jumped to themes. So I can correct it and say, please give a summary. No themes. Then maybe what we can do is put Becky's in there and be like, can you compare and contrast this to Becky? Oh, okay, so interesting, a tool to be managed versus an intimate part of your identity and personality. Distance versus little helper. So this is not completely unhelpful. Let's generate some codes and themes based on this. So some people really believe in this method of querying the data. And for me, it's coming up with some interesting kind of stuff. I've got some nice kind of summaries here, which are largely on point. The more kind of creative interpretations are interesting to kind of get my brain whirling about different metaphors that might apply. But then accuracy becomes a little bit of an issue. I'm asking it to come up with differences, similarities. Those are sort of interesting, but it's not quite clear how I'm going to use that yet. The codes are not particularly good, and these kind of themes are pretty rubbish, to be honest. Some people have argued that this method of querying the data has totally eradicated the need for coding. Some people believe in this method a lot more than I do, so they might be querying the data in a much more kind of interesting way, or a way that elicits a lot more insight. But for me, the idea that we can get rid of coding is a bit problematic. Querying the data in this way is a bit risky for me. It might come up with some great insights, or the insights could be completely made up. And you probably have to go back and check anyway, so then that kind of defeats the point of using a language model in the first place. And also, I don't want to get rid of coding as a process. I've talked through my manual coding process in another video, and for me, this is an important analytic step. Qualitative coding enables a close reading of the data, and it's a first step in teasing out that qualitative insight, which in part comes from you as a researcher. So what I'm interested in is using language models to help us code better. Many people will argue that language models just aren't any good at coding. But actually, what I've found is that with a bit of tweaking, these models can be actually pretty remarkable coders. So let me show you how I've been using language models to help me do qualitative coding. I've got Claude open again, and you can see here we can choose our model, but we can also choose our style. And here I have made a different style called Qualitative Coder. And what does this mean? Well, it's going to generate scholarly, precise, and deeply analytic research codes. Ooh, let's see how that works. Well, I'm going to go through a process of coding this data. Well, that sounds like a good way to go for me. My phone is my alarm clock. Okay, some interesting codes. Digital wake-up methods. One of those might work out quite well. All right, let's see what else has it got. Because I have not bought a separate alarm clock for myself, though I keep meaning to. Unfulfilled intentions, postponed purchases. Okay, these are kind of interesting codes. So what I could do now is start to copy and paste these codes, maybe in the comment function, or maybe I can just do this in text. I could say, what about tech-mediated digital wake-up methods? Nice. Okay, and then the next bit, because I haven't bought a separate alarm clock for myself, though I keep meaning to. Maybe something like digital dependency through postponed purchases. Not quite sure about that one, but I think that's interesting for now. So you can see that there's this kind of dialogue between the data, what the AI is suggesting, and then I'm kind of changing that as I copy it across. So what's going on here? Well, all I've done is, in this style, I've edited the system prompt. So this is what's being sent through to the model to kind of tell it how to behave. And I'm telling it that you're a research assistant specializing in qualitative analysis. Your task is to provide some pithy latent codes to label the specific data fragment and for the user to select from. I included this, please don't provide reasons around why you might find this difficult, just try your best, because it kept complaining at me that I hadn't provided enough details about the data. So just trying your best here. Your task is to provide only the code suggestions, so not any explanations, as a numbered list. So you're very welcome to borrow this system prompt from me. If you'd like to try this out for yourself, you'll need a paid for account to Claude, but you can also do a similar thing through ChatGPT. So this workflow is kind of fine, kind of interesting. Obviously, it's a little bit clunky. So we can go further to kind of make our own bespoke systems of AI-assisted qualitative analysis. So this might look a bit scary, but bear with me because it's actually really straightforward. This is just me making an API call to Anthropic. This basically just means I can implement this functionality in other things, such as this, which is a Jupyter notebook. And this is just a nice way of playing around with Python code. All I'm doing here is making a variable called input text, and I'm passing something called a string, which is a sequence of words, basically. For me, my phone is my alarm clock, which is the text that I passed into the language model just a second ago. And I'm calling that input text. Then I'm calling on my API key, which I've got already, and importing functionality from Anthropic. And then here, I'm calling on the latest model. So you can see down here, I'm using Claude 3.5 Sonnet. Same, I'm using 3.5 Sonnet latest. You could play around with the max tokens or temperature, but I'm not here. Then I've got my system prompt. And then I'm just passing in the input text as the message. So let's see what it comes up with. And you can see here a bunch of codes. So now I can just add a little bit of code there that strips out those suggestions. Now, the nice way of playing around with code in a notebook like this is you can edit your system prompt, and you can edit things like temperature, basically prompt engineering, so that the model is providing you with some helpful codes. So I basically had a play around with some of this, and then because I'm not a software engineer, I used this great little thing, this framework called Fast HTML, developed by Jeremy Howard at answer.ai. And all I did was follow the tutorials here to make my own little web app. So I am not going to talk through this code in any detail at all because it's incredibly hacky and does not represent best practice in any way. But something to note is that it is just one Python file and there's not very much code here at all. So Fast HTML is doing a lot of heavy lifting here, and we can see here, this is basically exactly the same as we've just seen in that Jupyter notebook. It's just making a call to the latest version of Claude Sonnet, got my system prompt, and I'm passing in the value. And it's doing a few other things as well, as I will show you. So I just have to run this. And then here it is. So let's try this again. Well, that sounds like a good way to go. My phone is my alarm clock. We've got a bunch of codes. Okay, nice. What are we thinking? Tech-mediated. Again, I like tech-mediated wake-up routines. But we've got a lot of interesting codes here because this is the way I like to work. I like to have lots of creative possible codes, and then I can select between them, or I can make a hybrid of some different codes. So we can just code that. Okay. And I tend to do a 5 to 10, 15 minute kind of thing where I go through emails that I've received the morning. Yeah, morning productivity pattern. But it's a kind of routines morning productivity. So you can see my workflow here is looking at the codes that the AI has suggested or the language model has suggested and then editing them for my own purposes. So I find this is a really helpful workflow for me, and it kind of speeds up my analysis but also gets me in the right frame of mind for analysis, and importantly puts a human in the loop for this whole process. So I really encourage you to have a proper play around with this if you're interested in the possibilities of language models for qualitative analysis. And you can see and experiment with what language models can actually offer you in a helpful way and in a way that kind of suits your mode of working. There's lots of ethical issues to consider as well, but let's do so reasonably. Some people argue that it's incredibly bad for the environment and climate warming using these models, and the pre-training of these models is hugely expensive, uses enormous data centers, but actually using these models can be incredibly cheap. So as you can imagine, I've been using my API pretty extensively this past month, and I've spent 28 cents so far. Months and months ago, I topped up my account with $20, and I haven't yet spent $1. Now, these services are charging this at profit, so this is more than the electricity cost. So it's worse to boil my kettle once than months and months of me playing around with this language model. So these current models are getting incredibly efficient to use, and there's lots of interesting stuff going on at the moment about optimizing even smaller models. Uploading data, of course, may be a concern. It does depend on what your data is. You may be able to anonymize it, so it's less of a concern. But also this method of feeding small fragments of data in at a time mean that you have a bit more control over what these models are actually passing, rather than uploading full anonymized documents to cloud services. Moreover, open source models such as Llama 3 can run locally on actually now consumer hardware. So this means that if you had a highly sensitive data set, you could, in theory, use a language model that's running locally rather than somewhere in the cloud, which means you would have confidence that none of that data is going anywhere else. There is so much more to explore in this rich and fast evolving area, so I hope that you'll join me in exploring the future of qualitative analysis with language models. So, Mikey Moo, something that I sometimes like to do is... Are you listening? Something that I sometimes like to do is... Well,